For introducing me earlier. It's a delight to be here. My name's James Hipwell from HP's Enterprise Group. I'm responsible for the public sector part of our business there. It's a delight to be here again as part of HP's sponsorship of this year's luncheon series. We may be a large multinational corporation, but we do rely heavily on our local partners. So I'd like to acknowledge the senior executives at our table from 4D, Patriot Alliance, F1 Solutions and Imperium, all Australian-owned companies. I'm also honoured to introduce today's speaker, Senator David Johnston, the Shadow Minister for Defence. I'm sure David's address, The Politics of Defence, will give us plenty to talk about at our tables. This has certainly been an interesting week in politics, but I'll leave the political commentary to the good Senator. Defence spending and budgets do seem to have been recently become a much more politicised area of policy than has been much in the last 2 decades. In a week where we remember those affected by the Bali bombings, it reminds us of the importance of ensuring and investing wisely in our national security. At HP, not surprisingly, we are strong believers that technology is a key enabler for not only improving the country's defences, but also improving efficiency and productivity. ICT is not just an overhead, a cost to be cut when budgets are tight. Investment in ICT can aid in reforming inefficient processes, saving money, which can be refocused in other areas. And with that little piece of self-serving advice, it brings me to our guest speaker today. Senator David Johnston has been the Shadow Minister of Defence since 2008. I'm always impressed with his openness and willingness to engage with industry on policy areas. I'm sure my experience is consistent with others in the room. After 2 decades as a solicitor and barrister, Senator Johnston was elected to the Australian Senate as the Liberal Senator for Western Australia in 2001 federal election. Since then, he has been an active member and chair of several committees, including the Privileges Standing Committee, the Joint Statutory Committee on Native Title and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders Land Account, and the Senate Employment, Workplace Relations and Education Committee. As a member of the Senate Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade Committee, and later as chair, David took a lead role in several inquiries, including the inquiry into the military justice system and the material acquisition and management in defence. Prior to his current role, he was Shadow Minister for Resources, Energy and Tourism and has been a member of the Shadow Cabinet since December 2001. Please join me in welcoming the Shadow Minister for Defence, Senator David Johnston.
Well, thank you, James. Can I acknowledge Anthony Bergen and your ASPI team, and thank you for the invitation to come here today. Rear Admiral Moffat, I want to acknowledge you. Seeing you next week, I believe. Looking forward to it. Senate estimates. To past and present members of the ADF, thank you for coming along. Members of the Diplomatic Corps and distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Look, you won't be hearing anything from me about misogyny or text messages or anything of that nature. You'll be very pleased to know. Today I want to talk about the precarious nature of understanding up at Parliament House in what I think is a very complex, discrete discipline and area, and generally the way parliamentary members acquire their knowledge and have some capacity to contribute to very important public debate in the area of national security, the area of the management and running of defence, and more broadly in some of the challenges that are coming over the horizon to us in the nature of the changing region strategically, cyber security and things of that nature. Now, we have a number of very significant problems as parliamentarians in dealing with the defence portfolio. I'll address those problems generally. You can imagine what they are. I'll touch briefly on aspirations, and when I say that, from an opposition perspective, I don't want anyone to think that I'm talking about policy. Our current defence policy is as laid out in the 2010 election. Very clear, no new money, very clear objectives, and I'll explain a little more why we are very reluctant to get into talking about projects, new money and things other than in a very general sense. You'll also be pleased to know that I won't be talking in a political vein per se. You've all seen and heard what's happened in the last budget. You all know what's going on with defence industry, and are aware of the politics. You see me regularly talking about unsustainable mess and things of that nature in the defence space. Well, we're not going to talk about that today. I was a barrister and solicitor in Kalgoorlie. I was elected in 2001. I specialised in the areas of mining and crime. Now, many of you have heard me say that only West Australians understand the synergy between those two aspirations. I was on my very first day, 1 July 2001, and I got a phone call. And on the end of the phone was a voice, David Johnston. I said, yeah. He said, John Hogg. And I said, hello, John. Who are you? He said, I'm a senator from Queensland. You're on my committee. I said, what committee is that? He said, Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade. I said, oh, that's good to know. You know, wonderful. He said, I'm down here at the frigate SPO. I need you to get your butt down here straight away because I haven't got a quorum. He was in Rockingham. And I thought, I wonder what the frigate SPO is. And I drove down to Rockingham thinking, oh, this must be important. And I sat there and he flicked a piece of paper over to me, which was an inquiry into the DMO. And I thought, I wonder what the DMO stands for. And I sat there and I looked at the numbers and I could hear the person in charge of the SPO, whose name escapes me, but talking about very large millions of dollars in various aspects. And I thought, crikey, my name could be on this. I better start doing some homework. And so that was the beginning of my interest in defence effectively, because I really, on the very first day as a senator, had to come to terms with the language. The language of defence, which I'll talk about in a moment, is very obscure, to say the least. I do speak, and Mori-san will know that I speak a very poor smidgen of Japanese, a very small amount of Japanese. I think the language in defence is much more complex than Japanese. So, in the quest to be able to speak the lingo to some poor extent and to understand what was going on in what is, as I will mention, I think 3 or 4 in terms of size of portfolio for the Australian government in terms of budget, I realised that in order to do any good in this portfolio, in terms of understanding, you had to get out with the uniformed personnel and understand what motivates them and what they do in terms of defending our country. So as a completely removed person from the science and skill and art of defence, I had 3 nights on HMAS Waller in Kakadu 2003 on the Parliamentary Defence Exchange. I had a skipper who has just recently retired from the submarine force element group, and we were wargaming against 2 Victory-class corvettes from Singapore. Now those little corvettes have all of the fruit in terms of anti-submarine warfare capability. They are a very capable German design. And I had, beautiful 3 nights sleeping underneath a 2,000-pound torpedo. I jokingly tell submariners I had a bit of Otto fuel just dripping right here. For those of you that don't get that, it's a highly toxic, corrosive, non-oxygen burning fuel that drives the torpedo. I also, part of this scheme, and there are many parliamentarians like me, I've had about 3 months altogether on surface ships. Arunta, Newcastle, Armidale, 16 hours in a P3 Orion out of Edinburgh via the Kwajalein Islands to Rimpak. I've done 3 Rimpaks. I've had the benefit and the investment of the Parliament in going to the United States on 3 occasions to see naval shipbuilding, to see the Aegis system at Moorestown, Bath Ironworks up in Maine, Pascagoula, and just recently we were fortunate enough to be funded by this Prime Minister, and I thank her greatly for it, the submarine construction facility that HDW runs in Kiel, then to Ferrol, to see Navantia's operation. down to Cartagena to see the Spanish submarine operation, to see nuclear submarine sustainment at Plymouth, then over to the United States, up to Andover to look at missile systems run by Raytheon, then down to see how the Joint Strike Fighter's coming along in Fort Worth, San Diego to look at General Atomics MQ-9 Reaper, and then lastly to Palmdale to look at Global Hawk, and that was all done in 18 days in May of this year. One of a number of trips that the Parliament invests in so that people like me have some vague concept of what is going on the cutting edge of technology and the sort of systems that we need to be aware of and we need to pursue. Having said all of that, I am still very, very much ignorant of the ways and means of defence. Not for 1 second does any of this, after 10 years in Parliament, have me think that I know enough to be able to say anything without being corrected by someone who lives and breathes it for a living. I'm just a slightly educated amateur. Now, there are a number of people here today, and looking through the list, I want to just acknowledge Catherine Zozing, Kim Bergman, the staff at DIAR, all of those people at Kokoda, Williams, Lowy and the Australian Defence Association. In opposition, Russell Stranger's with me today, this is us. Stuart Robert has my junior minister has an advisor. There are 4 of us. That is the opposition capacity in defence. And you know what we're up against. About 90 people in the 3 offices across onto the blue carpet in Parliament House. Now, where do we go to get assistance? The Parliamentary Library is pretty good. It's got 1 person that knows anything about defence, sometimes 2 on a good day. So all of those foundations, all of those journals, and may I say particularly, pausing to say particularly ASPI and its team, are what we have to live and breathe in order to understand this highly complex and discrete art that is national security and defence. Australian politics is of course extremely tribal in its nature, so winner takes all. We need to remember that. From opposition we have extremely limited opportunity to cost whatever we might think would be a good idea. Just having a reasonable idea would be a good idea. But the point is we have to listen to Australian industry. We have to listen to people in uniform who are often not permitted to talk to the likes of me, you should be aware. The Minister has to approve that. There's a whole lot of places I'm not allowed to go without ministerial permission, which is often not granted. And so when I look at the concept that ASPI is, you know, an independent, non-partisan think tank that took physical form in August 2001 with the calibre of people that sit underneath the umbrella of ASPI and produce the documentation that they do, I have to say that it was with no hesitation whatsoever that when the government was threatening to cancel the funding, we immediately put an appropriation into our policy to sustain ASPI into the future. Because for an opposition, we have nothing else really, apart from the people that I've mentioned who write good articles and educate us. The deep consideration and debate contribution and analysis that we must have to form a policy, and I pause to talk about Mind the Gap and what price a new submarine has too that I live and breathe. We must have debate, we must have informed debate, we must have contestability of ideas. And the people that I've mentioned and ASPI, I think I want to pause to say, and I do want to say, it is absolutely crucial that we acknowledge the contribution you all make to national security, because without opposition having information, having an understanding, having a capacity to contribute to the policy debate, we end up in a very dark place. That is, politics will run the show. And we can't have politics running the show. We must have facts, figures, analysis, as painful as often they may be. I note that ex officio, the Defence and DFAT secretaries sit on the board of ASPI. Obviously an extremely good thing. So having said what I've said about the inability of parliamentarians to bring to the game a lot of knowledge, even if you've been in the ADF, you usually are in such an area that it is inhibiting in terms of the overall big picture. We've had, whilst I've been in Parliament, 5 defence ministers. Robert Hill was a barrister from South Australia. Brendan Nelson was a medical doctor. Joel Fitzgibbon was an electrician. John Faulkner was a special education teacher. And Stephen Smith was a lawyer. Now, they all had extensive public policy experience, but none of them brought any particular knowledge, skill or understanding to the defence portfolio. And yet, we ask them to make very, very big decisions, all usually upon advice, but the government of the day has requirements, and those requirements often conflict with the departmental advice. So what do we end up with? We end up with a bit of a battle going on. We end up with, in some circumstances, the politics running the policy. Now, I really do think that is a serious concern. If we are making decisions based upon politics in this particular portfolio, we have a huge problem. This is the only portfolio that, on a regular basis, trains for the delivery of lethal force and trains to receive casualties. Now, nobody over in Parliament House really, save for those lawyers that have done a lot of coronial inquests and a lot of serious criminal driving trials and a lot of mining accidents, as I have, really understands how significant, and I have to pause to say I've done 24 funerals in the last 3 years, how significant this portfolio is in terms of its responsibility. It is also extremely complex. As I've said, the top 3 or 4, depending on how the budget's travelling in terms of budget size. The legislation, which is something all of us can, over there in Parliament, relate to, is complex and different, and I dare say a lot of people inside Defence don't look at their legislation. The Defence Act of 1903, the Naval Defence Act of 1910, the Air Force Act of 1923 and the Defence Force Discipline Act of 1982 are probably the fundamental building blocks of the legal basis for us to go forward and do things. However, the really difficult stuff is the Hague Convention, the Geneva Convention, the Rome Statute and the Wassenaar Arrangement. Now, they're things that the Parliament specialise in. That's the framework upon which Defence does its business. So that if I want to buy a UAV that fires Hellfire missiles tactically, I have to perfect the rules of engagement. I have to make sure that those rules of engagement comply with all of that law, so that I am protecting the man in the loop who's pressing the button. Now, that's my job. His job is to make sure that we achieve the purpose that that unmanned aerial system is designed to achieve. But I have to make sure that he's insured and that we do everything by the book. Now, the complexity of defence in modern kinetics and platform kinetics and their functionality is extremely complex, far and away beyond the capacity of virtually all parliamentarians. When we're talking about laser guidance systems, GPS systems, pixelated targeting systems, precision munitions such as Excalibur, which we have to use in an insurgency, the days of artillery just firing into the distance are long gone for us. We have people with mobile phones that will photograph every single end event. Excalibur is a very capable, fabulous round that has been used to 95% accuracy over 10,000 rounds in Iraq by the US. It is something that you need to know and understand, because if you're not firing such a precision munition, you're potentially in a lot of trouble. And those conventions and treaties that I talked about leave your people exposed. The really complex commercial thing that I spend a hell of a lot of my time talking about is platform acquisition and sustainment. You know, we spend very, very large sums of money. We've got $16 billion coming over the horizon for the Joint Strike Fighter, which I'll talk about in a moment. The real task in that for a parliamentarian is understanding that's 1/3 of the overall cost of the platform for its life. So when we talk submarines at potentially $36 or $40 billion, we're talking 1/3 of its cost for its life. These things dwarf most other projects, both government and private. We're talking things on a scale that is equivalent to Chevron's $55 billion at Gorgon, and so on. And then we turn to why we're doing all this, strategic analysis. If I did not have ASPI and other documents to look to, I would be left almost completely in the dark as to what's happening in the South China Sea, in the Sea of Japan, the Korean Peninsula, and so on and so forth. And then, of course, there's the broader Middle East, the European situation, the African situation, the South American situation, and so on. I must have a capacity to understand all of those things and what's going on, because we might be involved. We might be involved. We do things interoperably. When the United States says, let's go, we usually say, okay. So we've got to be on our game, watching what's going on. For us in opposition, it's impossible to do so without good advice, good information, and good analysis that is in the public domain. So discrete skills are required. We weren't brought into Parliament with them. I know the little bit I do about defence more by luck than good management. I then turn to the defence budget. This is a constant source of mystery to me. I have no idea how they get the figures and work out what they're doing on an annual basis. If I did not have the cost of defence that Dr. Mark Thompson produces every year, it would be a completely pointless exercise for us. We wait desperately for that document to come out. I think it's at lunch, a lunch like this, just after the budget. And then we try and rip it apart page by page to find out what on earth is going on in defence funding. And lastly, I want to go back to what I started with, the language. The Parliament is confronted with a language that most do not simply understand or have had any experience with. And I'll give you a couple of examples. A FEG that can deliver AIM-9, ASRAM, JDAM, JASM with stealth and be an ISR platform that is interoperable in a network-centric environment with AE and WC is a potentially regionally dominant capability. Now, I'm talking about a jet fighter. But you know, I've got to tell you, there's not a lot of people up there that would have any idea, and I certainly did not for a long time have any idea what that was all about. I go on. A subsurface conventional sea denial capability with a high indiscretion ratio with a low acoustic signature with high data rate comms in the littoral is also a regionally dominant capability. A submarine. The problem we have is that, and in some cases for good reason, the language and the science and the art is a very closed shop. Again, I say this presents massive problems. The acronyms, the complexity, and the depth of knowledge required to make decisions is a really serious problem when a minister is asked to sign off on a particular platform, on a particular mode of operation, on a particular operation full stop, a covert operation. He is asked to put himself in the shoes of the person with the knowledge. There is never enough time in the day, there is never enough questions to be answered. So we have a Prime Minister, a Cabinet, a National Security Committee and ministers who take advice, but also who reject advice. And this gets very, very dangerous and very, very hairy. So important decisions that determine just how our national security responsibility is discharged are made in our democratic process by people with very limited understanding of what the decisions actually mean. May I say to you that currently before the Senate is the Defence Export Control legislation. We will, at the stroke of a pen, completely inhibit, at the behest of our Wassenaar Agreement, the capacity of science and university researchers to do things without a Defence Export Control permit. Bear in mind that most of our research is largely funded from North America, East Asia or Europe. This presents special problems for our universities. Very few people up there on the Hill understand this. I think actually less in defence do. But the legislation is very one-sided. It's going to go through because it's bolted onto a treaty with the United States and it's going to cause a lot of problems. And you'll hear a lot more about it. Now I want to pause to thank the journalists and the analysts that are here today for the assistance that they give an opposition. I am learning a lot about the emasculation of opposition by a government, something that I have a solution to that I'd like to see changed. But without the people that I've mentioned, the forums that I've mentioned, the think tanks, the analysts, it would be one hell of a lot worse. So let's turn briefly to current issues that I want to talk to you about. The budget for defence is, as we all know, a problem. It's an unsustainable mess. That's from an extremely objective, well-respected source, right here in this room today. Now that causes me no sense of celebration. When a government decides that the insurance policy for the home and contents is not going to be renewed, but we will go on the annual holidays, I think this is a real problem. As I've said, without the cost of defence, without Mind the Gap, without what price future submarines, without the cyber security analysis, without all of those things, the opposition would be vestigial to the process. We try and make ourselves as relevant as we can. It's a difficult, painful job. Particularly when we do not have, in the 4 people that I've spoken to you about, the capacity to accurately cost any of our proposals. We're left to say, this is what it will cost because industry tells us, analysts tell us, someone else tells us. Half the time, they don't even tell us. So let's talk about our priorities were we to win the next election. Force protection is number 1. Men and women in harm's way must have the very best of combat protective equipment, the very best ISR platforms overhead and behind them. You'll see the proof of our dedication to this in the fact that every forward operating base in Afghanistan and Tarin Kowt has a comprehensive Giraffe CRAM system, counter-rocket artillery mortar system. I asked the Minister some long time ago why the Americans and the Brits had a CRAM system. He read out a sheet of paper that he had in his file at question time. He came up to me afterwards and said, "What is a CRAM system?" I said, "Counter-rocket artillery mortar." Read the Greg Scher file. Don't let them give you a redacted version and you'll see the problem. We've spent $300 million on protecting each of those forward operating bases so that up to 24 seconds warning is given for a 107mm rocket now. This is crucial. We were using an Arthur system we borrowed from Singapore. It was a very poor system. 2 days ago I received a question on notice, and I'm the king of questions on notice to defence. I have 300 on the go at any given moment. We have an unfunded liability from the 2009 white paper of $200 billion. This is the Force 2030 that the government has proclaimed the way to go. We are kept in the dark, but every now and then someone at Russell gives us a little bit of a tip. And that's one of them. $200 billion unfunded. It is extremely difficult to work out for me what the loss of $5.5 billion in the last budget is going to mean, how deep that wound is, and what sort of surgery is going to be required to repair it. what sort of damage that's going to do to the entity that is Defence. We can't work that out from opposition because we have to be kept, due to the tribal nature of politics, in the dark. They're not going to help us. They're not going to help us get elected. So we can only work out how deep that wound is from the day after we get elected, if we do. Navy is in a really bad place at the moment. HMAS Chills, our newest vessel, has blown up its transformer. It's totally an electrical powered vehicle, roll-on, roll-off design. We bought from the POMs, a very good ship, except what I'm hearing is we drove it too hard and burnt out a transformer. That's going to cost us somewhere around $1 million. Tobruk, when I was in Townsville last week, was anchored at the end of the channel. Blew up a clutch. Now, it does me no good to see one of our older vessels, yes, but a serious contributor to our readiness, anchored at the end about 3 kilometres off the coast in Townsville, unable to do anything. You've seen the fiasco of Manoora and Canimbla, the Rizzo report. You've seen Coles. I pause to talk about Coles. Coles is one of the first tranche is one of the most damning reports that I have ever in all of my life seen. It deals with administrative malfunction, but it also deals with malice inside Navy about submarines, inside the DMO, inside the ASC. I push really hard to get journalists to take some attention to this. It's so bad that Coles 2 I don't think is going to see the light of day. It's been restricted in its, and I think it's been sitting on the Minister's desk for some time, it's been restricted. Submarines, the SLEP program, Submarine Life Extension Program or Evaluation Program, is a huge undertaking for Defence. Collins is scheduled to be out of service in 2025. We've got nothing to put in the water and won't have anything to put in the water at that time. So we've got to extend its life to about 2033. It is already costing us $906 million a year for one boat, maybe two on some days. It's a massive problem. We then have to deal with that on one side of the ledger and C1000, going forward with a design that meets our requirements at a cost that ASPI tell us is somewhere around $36 billion. It is a very complex, significant issue. Air combat capability, I think, with most of our aerospace purchases, is relatively straightforward. The Joint Strike Fighter, for those of you that have any doubts about that, is going to be a fantastic platform. The distributed aperture system is able to detect a launch at 800 nautical miles. The steering array at 6 points out the side of this aircraft is a fantastic capability. The pilot sits with his helmet on in mid-air. He can see 360 degrees up and down everywhere. His radar capacity it's a classified figure, but let me say it dwarfs anything else in the marketplace. The data link is simply magnificent. MADL. It is able to talk aircraft to aircraft beyond the realm of when it's spoofed out electronic warfare capability. This thing is so powerful, so good, it will transmit illuminated and other designated targets, not just to other aircraft, but beyond. It's a fantastic, regionally dominant capability. We, as you know, are really taken with broad area maritime surveillance. Global Hawk is something we are really focused on. We have an ambition to bring real time across a number of platforms into Darwin and Canberra. It's not difficult. Yes, it's going to be reasonably expensive, but we should be able to do it properly with a decent program in the DCP bringing it forward. The other challenge for us in the future is the LHD. These two vessels are absolutely huge, bigger than HMAS Melbourne, are jet Stovall capable, a massive undertaking in terms for 2 RAR that are going to be the soldiers on board, the pilots, the skippers alone. Handling 28,000 tonnes is going to be a whole new experience. Our policy says we'll go back to 3% real growth as soon as we can. That's a bit rubbery, bit flaky. But given the problems that we have in working out where this portfolio sits in terms of its finance, which are in an unsustainable mess, what else could we say? The policy of 2009 in the white paper took politics out. We supported it. There was bipartisan support for that policy. We said, this is the way to go. We like it. It has been totally and utterly unfunded, leaving us in the lurch. So having said all of those things, I want to close by saying, what has it been like to have and be thrust into defence for the last 10 years? I have met some absolutely magnificent Australians. I enjoy their company, I respect them, and I look to talk to them and enjoy their company socially at every opportunity. Australian defence industry, similarly. People who are on the cutting edge of technology, working hard, making a profit, trying to get ahead. With one customer, it's extremely difficult. I want to finish by saying readiness is a very important notional aspiration of every nation. Military readiness is even more important. Now, we have a very highly skilled and capable defence force. I'd like to think, and I believe, one of the world's best. It is an extremely expensive goal, having them ready, well-equipped and capable. The government of the day has to put its hand up and commit to that. It has to say, yes, we will shoulder that burden of responsibility. And then they've got to measure it. They've got to make sure that the training is going on and that the readiness is actually real. Having committed to it, they then have to fund it properly. Achieving this is, in fact, if I may say so, the essence of the politics of defence. Thank you very much for listening.
Senator John Kerrin. From the Australian Financial Review. Just wonder if you could give me some more detail on that unfunded figure of 200
Sure.
billion.
Well, this afternoon I'll make sure I run the answer up to you, and you can read it personally yourself. I don't really know much more than the answer. I know that Angus Houston, after much argy-bargy, came back after lunch during estimates and said the total value of the acquisitions in the 2009 white paper was $275 billion in 2009 dollars. Now, at the moment, that answer arrived 2 days ago, Russell. 2 days ago, 200 billion of the 275 is an unfunded liability. John?
Yes. Thank you. Senator John Lord, your comments about reliance on ASPI and these other publications, I fully agree with, and as a person a bit dissociated from Canberra, they're absolutely essential. But it leads me to the thought that perhaps the neutral, professional advice from the bureaucracies is not that anymore. And I'm not trying to attack anyone in those, but it's not being written in that same open and frank manner that it used to be, and that therefore we all have to source a different opinion from somewhere else to get real analysis.
No, look, I agree, but I don't want to be critical either. The point is our defence heritage and convention is often behind a little bit of directing advice in a particular way. And by and large, it's not that significant. Every now and then it will be. Now, for instance, submarines in Australia, I think the functionality of the reporting framework is a bit dysfunctional. I think it needs reform. The culture in Navy is not conducive to that. There are vested interests that want to see submarines, and Coles spelt this out in great detail, that want to see submarines reduced in their stature as a deterrent. I actually think submarines are our very, very best deterrent. That's my view. And I have not read or seen anything to dissuade me from that. So I'm really committed to submarines. I think a new government, an Abbott government, will be really committed to them. But the contestability, I think, is something that the Parliament really needs, particularly in a time of economic constraint. I want to encourage people as senior chain of command members to be accountable for their decisions. I want them to protect their institutions. Now, I then need to temper that protective nature with some contestability. Now, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think ultimately I am Defence, or would be and would seek to be Defence's chief barracker and defender. I hope there won't be too many things to be defending in the future if I was to get the job. But I think leadership in that form and providing the support to those people to be accountable for decisions. I don't really get upset about wrong decisions as long as someone's having a legitimate go. But the ideas need to be contestable. They need to be on the table in our democracy so that we can all see where this is headed. And so that industry can say to me, look, I think you're going down the wrong path, and I can say why. And we can have a 2-hour meeting about what that person brings to the table in terms of knowledge and experience that is going to be in the national interest coming into my ears. Now, you know, I just think that it's really important that we understand that nobody in this space is the font of all wisdom. It's a moving feast of science, technological advancement, and we need to have an open mind but be respectful of the institutions within Defence.
Thank you. Kim Bergen.
Oh, Kim.
Senator Kim Bergen from Agency Defence Support. Two questions, if I might. The first is, should you become Defence Minister, could you give us a sense of what your priorities would be in your first 100 days? The second one is a plea on behalf of the media. But we've all noticed this trend of increase in micromanagement of the release of defence information. It seems to get worse year after year. Can I ask you your personal commitment that that's a problem you will address should you become Defence Minister?
Well, dealing with the second question first, I think if we get the decisions right and we immerse ourselves in the direction that things are going and we entrust the people in the department to make a decision, we have about 360 one-star and aboves in the Defence Department. We spend one hell of a lot on consultants, like about, I think it's 300 million every year. Now, I want those people to make decisions and I want to back them in their decision making, and I want them to be able to stand up and defend those decisions to the media. I mean, I think that's what it's all about. Now, if they're not prepared to do it, I will, if I think the decision is legitimate. Now, that doesn't mean I'm going to attack them if it's not. What was the first question again? Oh, priorities. Look, I tried to indicate the first priority has always got to be force protection, particularly when we're in combat. Now, that sounds trite, but when soldiers leave the soles of their shoes on the parade ground in Cairns, Townsville and Darwin after Anzac Day, and that happens on several occasions over 2 or 3 years, you know, it says to me the clothing SPO down in Victoria, what's going on there? Why is it when I go to Swanbourne I see a totally different uniform than the one I see at Laverack Barracks in Townsville? Now this worries me and also when parents write to me and say, I've just spent $500 on some kit for my son who's off to Afghanistan. Now, I don't get that. So force protection is a given. Can I tell you the biggest challenge for our whole country is submarines. just working out where we're at budget-wise is a really intense job to be done and burning a lot of midnight oil. Now, we have some plans to rearrange Defence to try and the big task for us is, if there are savings, capturing those savings. We have an extraordinarily hungry Treasury and Finance Department. You capture any savings and they will just rip them off. Now, we have to come up with a modus operandi that captures savings without damaging the institution, and then returning those savings to capability and to fixing some of the problems. So, you know, it's trite, but ask me if I get the gig in 2 months after that what my priorities are, and I should have a really big list for you.
Now, Kim, speak the story. Yes, at the back.
David.
David Ellery, Canberra Times. Thank you for a very informative speech. At a recent ASPI function, for dinner, Air Marshal Mark Vinson raised the spectre that Australia was at risk of losing its technological edge. He raised this in the nicest possible way, but one could only assume he was referring to the reduction in investment in defence and the increase in spending by other militaries in the region in much higher technology capabilities than they had in the past. If you do become the Defence Minister, and given the budgetary constraints that you will likely face, what do you see as the short-term fix to that problem, and then also the long-term solution?
Look, I agree with Mark 100%, and I agree with Michael Ward at Raytheon when he says that there's a problem with expertise leaving Australian defence industries. Can I say that 23,000 public servants running 59,000 uniforms is unsustainable? I say nothing more, nothing less. I don't want to talk about cuts because I don't want to wound any deeper the institution that is defence. But can I tell you, I don't think that number is sustainable. Now, there's a problem there. Having dozens of IT systems across defence is a problem. There are massive savings to be made. Just getting a handle on them requires input from within. What is happening in Australia today is this. Technical expertise is going to where the money is. Rio Tinto is running unmanned trains, diggers, boggers, you name it, up there in Hamersley from Perth Airport. Now, that sort of technology is sucking up every technologist, every electronics boffin, everybody who has anything to offer like there's no tomorrow. And they're finding that that type of employment, as rocky as minerals exporting can be in terms of security, is a hell of a lot more secure than working in defence. Now, that's the risk we run. We've got to get a DCP that is really well costed, reviewed quarterly, with milestones for tender releases so that people can really see what is going on. Now, initially there won't be much. We're broke. But ultimately we build upon those humble beginnings, and quarterly you will see the projects coming forward and people will be accountable for their failure to meet those milestones. And I think that'll give a lot of people a lot of comfort, particularly 2 or 3 quarters in where we have actually met those requirements. I think that's the beginning of getting confidence back into the space where technology will happily reside there longer. I think that's sort of broadly the direction we want to go. Now, there'll be problems because, as I say, I think the DCP in the first year is going to be pretty thin. But we want to work it up. We want to get back to the 3% real growth index to 2.5, the 1.96% of GDP that John Howard had us at in 2007. That's where we've got to be. And we're determined to get back there ASAP.
Thank you. Yes, table 9 again.
Max.
Top of the table.
Max Blinken from Australian Associated Press, Senator. I observed that you didn't make any commitments on spending matters, and neither did Mr Abbott in his speech to the RSL a couple of weeks ago, except in one specific area, and that was an undertaking at the first budget to index military superannuation. Now, my understanding of what the government says that's going to add something like $2 billion to the unfunded superannuation liability. How do you reconcile that against the fact that Defence is going to be $200 billion unfunded towards the Defence White Paper?
Very simply, Max, the government is not telling you the truth. This is the government that promised you a 2009 White Paper funded out to 2030 and then did not fund 1 red cent of it. Now, Kate Lundy, she has done an analysis. She is one of the prime movers of Matawi as an index base as opposed to CPI for veterans. She costed it at $90 million in the out years of the budget. Now, who are you going to believe? There's a letter that I've tabled from 4 Labor parliamentarians saying to Kevin Rudd, we promised this. Now, we have taken the burden. Yes, 40 years down the track it's expensive. But in the out years it's not expensive. And these people were loyal to us. And as my leader says, loyalty begets loyalty. We're going to fix this. It was promised to them. We never promised it. And that's our sin. But we never promised it and then didn't deliver it. So we're promising it and we will deliver it, and it's not expensive in the immediate short term.
I'll revert to table 9. Microphone here.
Senator Bill Tees from Ernst & Young. Absolutely vital, all the issues that you've covered, particularly around the budgets and the technologies. And we probably don't have time for you to cover this in detail, but I'm also interested in your thoughts around a key facet, that being the culture. We've got Broderick Review, DLA, Piper, and the list goes on. I'd be interested in your thinking around the cultural issues, which I think is absolutely essential to the future of the department as well.
Look, that's a really good question. It's one that occupies my mind a large percent of the time because I did the 2005 inquiry into military justice. But look, remember, these percentages in defence are below what's out there in the real world. And what's happening at ADFA is really big news because it's ADFA, not because it's happening. I can take you to any institution around Australia and show you similar scandalous conduct that kids get up to. Let's keep it in context. The real issue for us is this. Women are currently 14% of our ADF 59,000 uniforms. They are doing things that are absolutely crucial and essential to our national security and will grow and increasingly do more and more. Now, we have to make the ADF a user-friendly environment for those employees and for the blokes. So childcare centres, I'm really keen to look at the cost of childcare across the board. I don't think it's going to be expensive because every time one of those highly skilled female wing commanders leaves the RAAF, several $1 million of training and investment just waltzes out the door, and we're not on top of that game. Now, the culture is one of commercialism. We've got to be commercial. The miners don't let this happen. Siemens doesn't let it happen. They have people working from home. Now, we've got to switch on that we have invested one hell of a lot of taxpayers' funds into the knowledge we have built up in these really highly trained technological people. A lot of them are women, and we've got to keep them on board and be prepared to spend good money to keep them on board. Now, when we start to do that, I think the culture's already pretty good. Criticise me if you like, but I think it's pretty good. With 59,000 people, we have our events. But, so does everybody else. But the reform is in the way we manage our people. So that when I see a retention bonus for submariners where the able seaman steward is earning more than the navigator, I have a huge problem with that. We're going to be on top of that game.
Okay, I think so. I'll go back to table 9.
Senator Christian Holmes from Defence Business Review. In his recent speech to the RSL conference, Mr Abbott said, he criticised this government's trend towards foreign military sales acquisitions, but then 4 paragraphs later said, if elected, he would fast-track the global hawk acquisition.
Sure.
I wonder if you'd speak to how a coalition government would ensure a viable defence industry into the future.
Well, you'll see it in that DCP that I set out, because we really want to focus on getting particularly Sydney and Melbourne going. If our economy is going to get back to some real proper growth rates, we've got to get some of the heavy industry capacity in Sydney and Melbourne functioning again. Now, why have we bought a whole host of the equipment we've bought? Fundamentally because the projects are not being sooled along. We've gone to aerospace purchases, C-17, Growler, C-27J, all because it's really easy to do. It's a dollar figure that fits into the budget that says, look how busy we are, look at the money we're spending. Now, it is really a bit of a shop front that's got no substance behind it. What we should be doing is not threatening our DPCU manufacturers with Chinese options or buying from Mexico via the United States, CRY, printed DPCU. We should be doing it ourselves, particularly when we've got low infrared technology built into it. There's a whole host of things. If you look at the DSTO's capability management, whatever it is, the capability contest where people put up their projects to defence, we want to be funding and participating in many more of these, because I see a lot of them who just can't get a start, and I always think to myself, this looked really good. Now, there's massive opportunity for us to look down into Australian industry, not just defence industry, and invest in our capability. It's not satisfactory to just say when we've got a budget underspend, because we gave back 1.5 billion in 2011. It's not enough to say, oh, we'll just go FMS and we'll buy another plane or series of planes. That's what's happening. Now, let me tell you about Global Hawk. Global Hawk, in the face of 6,500 people arriving this year by boat. Many of them, a very significant proportion of them, we never even hear about or see about because they perish. And I'm talking about the air-sea gap between Christmas Island and Sri Lanka, and then across to Indonesia. Now, how do we patrol that area? What is the best capacity we have? We could probably use some satellite capacity, but it's extremely expensive. Broad area maritime surveillance, the Global Hawk platform, with its suite of infrared, its FLIR pod, and all of the other kit, some of it very technical and exclusive, is exactly what we need to have patrolling our far maritime frontier. The objective that I see, that one of the things that I really want to achieve, is real time across a number of platforms to Darwin and Canberra, so that what you saw with President Obama via satellite happening in Abbottabad, we should be able to do on our maritime frontier. Now, we can do it, but it's someone else's satellite usually. It might be our own, but it's extraordinarily expensive. The unmanned aerial system is exactly ideal for our vast maritime frontier. Now, that's a functional platform. It's something we've spent $100 million on already in participating, and we were just ripped out of the program 3 years ago. It is not in any shape or form a convenient spend. It is a functional platform that we really do need.